2024 might as well been renamed the year of elections. I mean, more than 50 elections happening across the world, around 20 of them happening on the African continent. So it's a busy year for democracy. And of course, some of the elections already took place in Africa. But to discuss more on the democratic front of things, I'm joined by Nic Cheeseman. He is the Professor of Democracy and International Development at the University of Birmingham. Nic, thank you very much for joining me. I think I want to start with a very obvious question. I know Africa is a very large continent and there are different pockets and things are happening in different places. But in general overview, what is the state of democracy in Africa? Have we made progress or are there still various areas of concern?
I think, like you said very well, it's a big continent. And one of the things I always say to people is, there's not one Africa where democracy is concerned. Maybe there's four Africas. There are countries that have sustained democracy at a reasonably high standard despite the global decline of democracy. So there I'm thinking about countries like Ghana, which goes to the polls at the end of this year. There's also countries where we've seen, significant autocratization, the strengthening of authoritarianism. There we can, imagine countries like Zimbabwe, which of course had, poor quality elections back in 2023. Uganda, where electoral manipulation is one of the things that keeps President Museveni in power. And then we've also got, obviously, the recent spate of coups that have reversed civilian governments across certain West African states. And we've got countries that kind of seem to yo-yo between getting more democratic and then having a, backsliding to authoritarianism. So countries like Zambia and Malawi that sort of seem to be at times moving towards democracy and then at times having setbacks. So I think we have to understand all of that complexity to start with. But within that, I think it's been a tough couple of years. COVID-19 led to deterioration in civil liberties in many countries around the world, and that was also felt in Africa. And we've also seen, I think, in the last few years, African leaders becoming emboldened to challenge democracy and to pursue essentially the expansion of their own powers, partly because they don't think Western governments are going to come and try and protect democracy, partly perhaps because the increasing number of authoritarian governments around the world makes it seem like a safer option. And so there has been a kind of gradual process of backsliding. But I do think it's important to note that although the quality of democracy is under threat and has been, declining in recent years, Africa in some ways has perhaps not been hit quite as badly as some other regions. And almost every year we have a country that goes the other way and provides, democracy a shot in the arm. We had Malawi, we had Zambia. They were the only two countries in the world to move towards democracy during the COVID pandemic, were Zambia and Malawi. This year, we've already had Senegal, where an opposition won, against all the odds. Back in 2016, it was Gambia. Before that, 2015, it was Nigeria. So despite the fact that things are tough, I think it's also important not to become despondent and to recognize that actually there's some good, positive democratic news pretty much every year.
Hmm. Well, from a healthy democracy discussion to, like you said, authoritarianism is still very much prevalent in parts of Africa. And I'm always curious because I did a massive report on it a while back about all these different countries and, the political freedoms that they enjoy. And I always wonder and I ask myself, if you live in a country like that, where the playing field is unequal, how is an opposition party given, let's assume that there are democratic processes and it's not completely been shut down, but it's still an authoritarian state. How can an opposition party move in and bring about change in a country like that? I mean, where are the levers for that?
It's a great question. I think the first thing we have to say is sometimes it might be impossible. Sometimes it's a bit patronizing to say to the opposition, if you just did this, this, and this, you could win. Sometimes the level of repression is just so high, it's almost impossible. And I think that tends to happen when the security forces effectively become the government and say that, we're not willing to allow anyone other than this candidate to win. In Zimbabwe, we've had military leaders effectively saying, we're not willing to salute anyone other than a ZANU-PF president, effectively meaning they wouldn't allow Morgan Tsvangirai or now Nelson Chamisa to become president. In Uganda, we get the security forces effectively ensuring that President Museveni retains power and being deployed to shut down Bobby Wine. In some of those contexts, I think it's just really, really difficult. But there are some things we can learn. And actually, I'll send you a link after we've chatted because we had a show on the Resistance Bureau show that I am part of yesterday, where we had leaders from Zambia, from Senegal, talking about Nigeria, talking about exactly this question: how do you win unfair elections? And so we've got a few things, that do work. So one of the first things, of course, is forming a broad coalition. Opposition leaders are much more likely to win when they're in coalitions with a number of other opposition leaders. One reason for that is, of course, you look more inclusive and you're able to bring in more ethnic groups or more parts of the country. But another reason is also, of course, that it becomes harder to play divide and rule politics. One of the things that authoritarian governments often do is try and stigmatize people as either being tribalist or they've only got support in one part of the country. So forming that broader coalition can be really valuable to actually reject some of that kind of character assassination and say, no, I'm a responsible, inclusive leader. Another thing that we see that's often very successful is really trying to emphasize over a long period of time building a strong grassroots structure. And it's true that politics is more digital than it's ever been before, but actually protecting the vote requires you to have 2 or 3 people at every single polling station. And in countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, there could be 30, 40, 50,000 polling stations. You could need 400,000 people just to protect the vote. So you actually have to do the legwork for that, and you have to do the legwork 2 or 3 years before the election to be able to actually put together that kind of process. And for that, you then need to be credible, right? You need to be able to actually secure money and funding, for example, from the diaspora, but maybe also from companies because people actually believe that you could win and you would do a better job, which means you really need to be careful in the way that you manage things like local government. And I think in South Africa, of course, this is a big issue. If you see a party claiming that it's going to be able to do a great job nationally that's currently in opposition, but you know that it's in control of part of the country where there have been massive corruption scandals, you start to ask yourself, is this actually serious change? And that then becomes something that can undermine the legitimacy of a government, of an opposition, or become something they can rely on as evidence that they could do a good job. Final point that I think is important is you need to be able to connect to citizens and persuade them to believe that change is possible. And so one of the things that came up on the discussion we were having about this with Chipo Wanawasa from Zambia, who played a role in the election victory of Hakainde Hichilema. She was within the campaign team and is now an advisor to the president in Zambia. And that she was talking about is that Zambians genuinely believed they could get rid of a bad government. They had done it before. In 2011, they voted out the government. 1991, they voted out the government. And Zambians standing in the queue on election day, and I was there, would tell you, if enough of us come and enough of us vote, we can get rid of this election. So there was a belief in Zambia that the ballot box could be used to change power. And even though the election was in quite a constrained environment, we actually saw, I think, especially through social media and through discussions through different generations, a real belief amongst Zambians that you could affect change through your vote. I think it's much harder to get people to believe that and turn out because of that in countries where you've never seen a transfer of power. And so, Zimbabwe, Uganda, countries where we've never seen the opposition win at the ballot box, I think it's a much bigger challenge for them to make people believe it's worth voting, that it is in those countries where we've actually seen 2 or 3 transfers of power. And so one of the things I think we perhaps need to start doing also, if we're thinking about this more kind of analytically, is saying, there's a set of countries where we've seen transfers of power, where people believe in democracy and elections, they believe in the ballot box, and those countries have a certain trajectory which is perhaps more positive than a set of countries where the military prevents that from happening. People don't have that in their memory. I call it kind of democratic memory. People don't have those democratic wins in the backs of their minds to call upon, and it maybe becomes even harder to mobilize people because people naturally feel like, what's the point of risking going out to vote when there could be violence, and what am I going to get? Ultimately, I know that the government's going to rig the election.
And that's exactly the problem we face in South Africa. It's not so much, we could possibly face violence, but there's been a strong decline since 1994 in voter participation rates in South Africa, more so among the youth, which is extremely problematic. And when we face an election like the one we're doing on the 29th of May, where really the change is going to happen at the margins, the numbers and the figures are going to be very fine, very close, depending, it's going to ultimately decide whether the ANC continues with the majority rule or whether we go into a coalition, and more important, who can enter into those coalitions. So how do you bake into a message to voters when they've kind of lost hope that they can bring change through a ballot box, but when it is so needed and so required, when everything is at stake? What's the message then to get them to believe that again? I don't know if that's a difficult question to
I was
answer.
going to say that's an impossible question. If I knew the answer to that one, I would probably be so rich that I might not be sitting here doing the podcast. No, I'm joking. I think there's two things to say. Let me start with the point about the youth and youth attitudes. I think that's a really important point, and then maybe we can between us see if we can come up with an answer to the question. I think one of the things that really worries me is the attitudes of young people towards democracy, and this is not just South Africa. So I was recently doing some analysis looking at Afrobarometer trends over time and looking at the data, the Afrobarometer survey, which anyone who's listening can get online for free from afrobarometer.org, the data that they collect. And if you look at the Afrobarometer data from the last round, that the youth are the least democratic demographic, right? So if you look at every age category, young people under 35 are the most likely to be unsupportive of democracy or to tolerate authoritarian alternatives. Older people are actually more likely to hold pro-democratic views. It's not a massive difference, but it is a difference, and it's there across many countries. And that makes sense to me, right? I mean, a lot of younger people don't have the memory of how bad authoritarianism was. They don't remember how bad military rule was or one party state was. They don't remember how bad the economy was back then. But they're also particularly frustrated by the lack of economic growth, the lack of jobs. Many young people got sacked during COVID because they were the most recent hires, so they were the first ones out the door. And so it makes total sense to me that young people have this frustration and this anger. And of course, as we talked about, if you then see elections that don't bring change, either because you've got a dominant party like the ANC in South Africa or because it's being rigged, why do you go to the ballot box? So how do we bring those people back? I think part of the thing is that people like me who are now, close to being 45 are probably too old to design, the kind of social media campaign that might bring back and excite young people about democracy. So perhaps one of the answers is we need to be better at actually getting young people in the room and enabling them to make those decisions. I think one of the things we perhaps need to try and do over time is to bring more young people into parliament. So most parliaments around the world don't have youth quotas. Most of them don't have many young people in under the age of 35, for example. And I think that's, a significant barrier. But I think ultimately young people are not that different to anyone else in the sense that they're more likely to go and vote if they think there's something worth voting for and they think their vote matters. Now, it'd be really interesting in this election in South Africa because my suspicion is that the ANC will dip below 50% and will need to go into perhaps a coalition with one party or another. Maybe only one small party for a small number of seats, but maybe they'll need to. And will that, and the fact that the election is close, and the fact that we have people like Zuma and MK now potentially on the ballot, will that change of context actually excite young people and make them want to get engaged and think that it's worth voting, or will we see a continuation of the apathy? And I think that's what's quite interesting to me. I think one of the things though that we have to be very clear about is, you can do all the PR in the world, you can bring in brilliant artists, hip hop stars, movie stars, you can have a rock the vote campaign. But if people see the fundamental reality hasn't changed, that's not going to get them to the polling station to cast their ballot. And so, in that sense, sadly, a lot of this is going to fall on, the political leaders who have often failed us so far in terms of actually, giving a better example, demonstrating that votes can change policies, and actually enabling, this by allowing elections to be reasonably free and fair. Now, one of the things I think is really interesting about South Africa this year is that, although we've had so many concerns over state capture and many institutions being subverted through state capture, so far that doesn't seem to have had an impact on some of the key institutions like the Electoral Commission. And generally speaking, people seem to think that the Electoral Commission will do a good job and be independent. But the risk, of course, is that the longer you have that corruption in politics, the longer you have state capture, and the closer elections get, the more tempting it will be for those in power to try and subvert those institutions. And so I think one of the things that I'll be watching very carefully, both because it's important in itself, but also because it will send a message that might inspire or create apathy amongst the youth, is how will the Electoral Commission perform if the election's close and the ANC might be getting under 50%?
Yes, it's something I think that everyone, or at least every South African, is I think keeping in the back of their minds, how it will play out. But I do believe the majority of South Africans trust our electoral commission, which I know can't be said for a lot of the countries throughout Africa. So we will have to see how that plays out, depending on how close it is. But, you know, throughout Africa, we also see a lot of leaders who and parties who sometimes live far past their sell-by dates in keeping in power, and we don't see this transition of power. But it has happened in a couple of countries where long-standing dictators, long-standing liberation movements have finally been, I don't want to use the word toppled, but at least moved out of from the seat of power. And I was wondering if you have ever noticed characteristics or signs in a democracy where the time is ripe for something like that to happen in a country, where you can see where the time is right for the opposition to start moving in and taking over the rule of power.
Well, just on what you were just saying, I just quickly checked on the Afrobarometer, and one of the things that's quite interesting is there seems to have been in the last couple of rounds, so Afrobarometer surveys every couple of years, in the
Mm.
last couple of rounds, there seems to have been a big shift in the percentage of people saying they don't trust the Electoral Commission in
Oh,
South Africa. Now, as you say, still a lot of people trust this commission versus other countries. But according to the Afrobarometer, the number of people who don't trust the commission or say they don't trust it has increased by 9% over the last couple of years. So that's an interesting thing, and I wonder whether that's related to anything particular to do with the Electoral Commission, or whether rather that's just a feature of people losing confidence in the government more broadly, and the Electoral Commission kind of gets tarred with the same brush. But it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. In terms of your question, absolutely. I mean, and I think we've seen this play out, before in a sense. South Africans, of course, sometimes like to think of themselves as a bit exceptional within Africa. But sometimes I say to South Africans, well, look, we
we
have
do. I'm
seen
not going to
dominant.
lie, we do.
Yeah. We have seen dominant parties collapse in the past, right? Look at what happened in Ghana, in Kenya, in Zambia. These were dominant political parties that established dominant systems after independence. We had parties that were in power for 30, 40 years. And a bit like the ANC, they fused kind of national liberation struggle credentials with economic management, and tried to build and sustain legitimacy that way. And most of them had two problems that basically brought them down, right? One was economic mismanagement. Over time, corruption, lack of economic growth, lack of jobs basically undermined confidence and support for them. The second was generational change. You started to have young people who didn't remember the anti colonial struggle, who didn't remember that these leaders were founding fathers, whose main experience of that party in power was unemployment, and poverty. And those two factors together over time basically eroded popular support for those parties. And then you start to see the opposition parties making ground. I mean, of course, in those cases, what had to happen first was the campaign for multi-party democracy, forcing the one-party state or the military regime to hold elections, and then the opposition could be competitive in the elections. So I think that is a process we've seen before, and we have an understanding of how it works. In most cases, in my experience, what actually is needed, though, to defeat that party and bring that party down is a split within the party that takes a significant percentage of that party out. And I think we thought we might have had that in South Africa when we had COPE, right? Then there was the EFF.
That's
It's
right.
never quite happened. We've never seen a really big faction of the ANC moves directly into opposition. Now we've got Zuma and MK. It'll be really interesting to see what percentage of the votes he can make. But if you look at a lot of what happened in other African countries, it was really the point at which a certain faction within the ruling party got, disgruntled, got forced out, went into exile, went into opposition, and then, there was a period where they were kind of being repressed. And after a while, though, they would come together with the other opposition people who'd already been there, with civil society, with business groups that had got frustrated, and they would all then come together in this broad coalition for change. The question I think we have in South Africa then, is twofold. Is one, are we going to see, a significant split where significant ANC leaders and votes are taken out of the party and put into the opposition? And then two, are we ever going to see a broad opposition coalition that's capable of defeating the ANC? So, give you a quick example. What does it take to defeat the Kenya African National Union in Kenya that have been in power since 1963? It took the formation of the National Rainbow Coalition, which was a broad coalition, lots of different leaders from lots of different ethnic groups come together in 2002 to inflict the defeat that took, the one-party state government out of power. In South Africa, it's obviously going to require something similar. It's not going to be possible to beat the ANC for the next 10, 20 years unless there's a broad opposition coalition that brings people together. So one of the things that I'll be interested in looking at is not just how does the election operate, but how do the opposition leaders who don't win see the results? How do they interpret that? And do they start to think about forming an alliance for the future?
Well, they tried. The DA came forward with the Moonshot Pact, and today's reports have stated or suggested that it's already been crumbling. Um, and that's one of the questions that so many South Africans always ask. Given all the ANC's failures, South Africa's opposition just doesn't seem to be rising to the table. It just doesn't seem to garner the support, and there could be various explanations for it. We are a multicultural country with different cultures, different languages, different backgrounds, different lived realities, and I think that sometimes makes it difficult for a coalition formation to come forward and really bring about change. I could be wrong, but the latest polls, most of them show that the MPC, which the DA has tried to create with this multi-party coalition, won't come anywhere near the sufficient numbers to take over government. So and there's already been some squabbling. So I'm not sure that that is going to be the ultimate route for South Africa to go. But I want to get back to another point that you also mentioned is that, the closer an election gets, the result gets, the more tempting it becomes to try and interfere somehow. And, is this something that still regularly occurs, I'm assuming, throughout Africa? And what are some of the methods, modus operandi, that some of these governments have tried to use in the past?
It's a great question. I mean, just very briefly on the coalition, absolutely. I mean, it's hard to imagine, Zuma and Malema coming together, or them and the DA coming together. Right? The broad coalition you would need to beat the DA would pretty much have all of them in it, and they are incompatible personalities. On the other hand, one of the things we know from countries like Kenya is that sooner or later, if you understand that you're going to die without winning power, or you're going to have to form a coalition, sooner or later people often do form a coalition. And even people who are fierce rivals have managed to come together. I mean, the most remarkable one, of course, in Kenya was when Uhuru Kenyatta and William Ruto came together, despite the fact that they were indicted at The Hague for inciting violence against each other's communities in the previous election, right? So any coalition is possible at some point, but I understand what you're saying about the challenges. It's a really good question about what do we see. I mean, I think there's three different sort of sets of ways you can do this, right? One is you rig it through the actual election itself. In other words, you try and rig the vote. You either stuff ballot boxes, or you burn, or you put in the river opposition ballot boxes, or you simply fake the numbers when you're doing the counting process, right? That's one. That's probably not viable in South Africa for the reasons we've talked about, with the greater confidence in the South African Electoral Commission, because you need the complicity of the Electoral Commission to be able to do that. But there are, of course, other ways. You can misuse state resources and use them to fund an election campaign that spends twice as much money as any other party, right? That's something the ANC has effectively been doing through the corruption and through the recycling of that money into political leaders' hands, but also into party hands. That's something that the ANC has been doing to give itself an inbuilt advantage. You can, of course, try and manipulate the media, either through censorship, which is perhaps harder in the South African context, but also through using, the government's agenda-setting power, and also putting a lot of pressure on media houses and pressure on public broadcasters to make sure that you're the dominant voice that people get in their media. The other set of options, I think, then become, are the options that tilt more towards things like intimidation. So there, for example, we see deliberate attempts to intimidate opposition supporters to make them feel unsafe, to intimidate opposition candidates. And often that involves a combination of what I call kind of subtle violence, which is not necessarily committing so much violence you get in the newspapers and election observers can see it, but threatening violence, or just doing enough violence, just beating enough people up, just harming enough people, just burning enough down enough houses, that in other parts of the country you could say, did you see what happened over there? If you don't vote for us, that'll happen here too. So you kind of, we call it kind of, shaking the matchbox. Once you've burned down one person's house, you just need to stand next to the other person's house with the matchbox, and they get the message. You don't need to burn all the houses down. So one of the things we see is that kind of use of violence and intimidation. The other thing, of course, that we now haven't talked about so far, but is going to be very significant in South Africa, is disinformation, hate speech, aggressive messaging, either against individual candidates or against individual communities. And one of the things, that I saw in Nigeria, where we did a research project on fake news and the use of mobile phones and technology around elections, is, these are really effective messages in certain contexts. So one of the messages that seemed to have been effective in one of the places we were was that there was a lot of violence around one of the polling stations around 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock on a voting day. And this was a very specific message about a very specific polling station. It used a picture that suggested that this was the violence that was happening. So basically, you do a bit of analysis. Turns out that this picture, of course, wasn't even of the country. It was another political riot in a different country that had been used. And basically, it was coming out of accounts that were in favor of one political candidate. That candidate is a candidate that was expected to perform particularly badly in that polling station. So, what that candidate is basically trying to do is scare those voters into not going to that polling station because they're assuming that almost all of those voters are going to vote for the other guy, by using the fake story that there's violence outside the polling station, it's too dangerous to come. Now, the reason that's particularly powerful in the context of polling stations and election day is A, you don't have a lot of time for the other side to get out the message that this is fake news. So whereas in a campaign, you can have 2 or 3 days after the fake message to try and correct it and push out the different message, on voting day, you can't do that, right? In a couple of hours, the polls are closed and those voters haven't gone to the polls. But second, it also plays into a trope in people's minds that there could be violence around the polling station, and therefore it plays into something that's in the backs of people's sort of minds already. And one of the things we found in our research is it's quite hard to fabricate a fake news story out of nowhere. People are quite skeptical about WhatsApp and Twitter. They know that a lot of what's on there is basically false. But if you can tap into something that they already think might be true, if you can tap into a trope, if you can tap into an idea that is deeply rooted within that community, that then becomes much more likely to take on a life of its own. So those kinds of messages, I think, we need to worry about. And one of the things that I'll be interested in as I watch the, coverage that you guys and others will be doing of the election is, what are the strategies being used by the ANC at different levels? So there's one thing in terms of the national campaign where we generally find that people don't use these strategies because it's easy to connect it to the presidential candidate. It becomes very embarrassing. It'll be on the front page of all the newspapers. It's often something that's decentralized. It's done by local councillors, local candidates, etc. It's done by different units, or it's outsourced to influencers who aren't directly employed by the party but are known to be associated with the party, all of which creates a kind of plausible deniability. So one of the things that would be quite interesting for me, as you were saying earlier, is what is the ANC willing to do to stay in power or to get 50%, which of course is a very psychologically important mark, and at what level and how will they actually do it? And that will be really important, not just for this election, but what that means for how free and fair the next election is going to be.
And I mean, that is something that is very realistic to play out in South Africa. That's not a, can we cook the numbers kind of thing. People still live with the remembrance of the July 2021 riots, which happened after Jacob Zuma was incarcerated. And that was a really big threat. And a lot of people were really scared. So it's still in the back of people's minds. And I don't think it will take a lot to spark those memories and, like you said, create fear about just simply going to one polling station. So that's definitely a strategy that I think South Africans will watch out for. Um, maybe you can answer this question is because I think it was at the India elections where there was quite a big uproar around, fake news, deep fakes in a massive election. Is that something that we're seeing happening, deep fake messaging and videos spreading throughout Africa when it comes to these elections? I know it's kind of a new take, but to me, it's very
It's a new
concerning.
tech, but we have seen it in different contexts. So one thing that's really important, perhaps to say to listeners first, is that the research we've done shows that basically the more advanced the media and the more media, the more likely people are to trust the message. So if you send someone a fake message and it's just text, right, it's just this basic text message, people are quite likely to disbelieve it. If you send that with a photo that purports to show the thing that you're talking about, if the photo is reasonably well done, that significantly increases the likelihood that people will believe that message. If you then turn that into an audio note, it goes up again. If you then turn that into a video with sound and video and audio, that goes up again. So the likelihood of people believing the fake story goes up with the kind of sophistication of the media. That's where deep fake is so important, right? Because all of a sudden, it's not here's a picture that someone could have taken 2 years ago or could have been from another country. It's actually the candidate's voice with the candidate's face saying, could be something terrible, right? Like, let's attack that other community, or let's steal all the money, or let's rig the election, or whatever it is. We haven't seen as much of it as I would have thought we would have had so far in Africa. So in the Kenyan elections of 2022, and the Zimbabwean elections of last year, that was something I was really looking for, because I thought the tech had got to the point where it would be feasible for people to do that. And the experts that we talked to said to us, the tech is now at the stage where you, with your eye, would not be able to tell necessarily, just with a quick glance, that it was fake. You would
It's
actually, with
scary.
some of the new technology, have to send the message to a lab who could tell you, we've done the analysis, actually, we can see that it's been manipulated, but you wouldn't be able to tell. And so I was really worried about that. Interestingly, we didn't really see it. There wasn't, there was one attempt in Kenya to kind of fake a message that basically spliced different bits of William Ruto speaking, and put them together. But it was so badly done, it was obviously fake. There was no actual attempt to create an entirely new message through using AI technology, for example. So we haven't seen it so much so far. I do think it's the thing that's going to come, and I do worry about it, because I think people have kind of got skeptical about all the other kinds of messaging, but because that would be so new, and because awareness of deepfake technology is so limited right now, not just in Africa, in many parts of the world, the initial impact of that message, I think, would be much greater. And it would take a long time after the message to actually communicate to people that it was fake, and that this technology is out there, and that you now need to actually kind of not only challenge these other messages you've been getting, but even video messages you need to second guess. But it's also going to be tricky, right? Because whereas with a visual, with a standard picture, if someone just sends you a standard image, you can do a reverse Google search, and you can find out quite quickly that that image, was taken in Sudan in 2019. Much harder to do that with a video. So I think there's a lot of challenges that deepfakes are going to bring to us that we haven't got the tools to resolve right now, but we haven't yet seen them play a massive role in African elections. It will be interesting to see whether we'll see them in South Africa.
I'm trying to think now. I think it was a political party in India that used a hologram of a former um, party leader, which obviously pulled at emotional strings. And that you saw it, and this person spoke kind of the words that the new leader wanted them to speak. It was a hologram or a video of some sort. So and I just thought, you know what? Especially in African states that are still so tied to a liberation movement, and the liberating Euros, or the liberators and the Euros associated with them, with the struggle movements. When you do something like that, you can create a massive emotional shift that could possibly be dangerous if it's used incorrectly. So, and it's interesting that it hasn't been used in Africa as much, like you said. Like I would have expected that is something that have popped up more regularly than it has. You say that, to the international community, it's so important to help these states to build up their democratic institutions and support them. My question is that we know that there is underlying currents changing on the African continent when it comes to superpowers and their influence. We know that Russia and China and the US, and more recently, you could argue for India also vying for more sway on the continent. How is that changing the democratic winds on the continent, if at all?
I think it's changing it in two ways. I think one way that that's changing things is that we start to see, obviously, African governments having a much wider range of partners to choose from when it comes to development and the economy. And that's great, right? I mean, that's what we would want. We would want that because it empowers governments to have agency and to be able to set the agenda, and not to have to do what they're told by foreign powers, which is great. The risk, of course, is it means you can pick the foreign powers who are happy with you, abusing your own citizens and being corrupt, rather than the ones that want to stick up for your citizens and reduce corruption. And that's the challenge. So that has been a big process. And we talk a lot about China and Russia, but we should also be talking about, depending on where we are in the continent, Saudi Arabia, India, Iran, etc. It's not just China and Russia. Turkey, for example, there's a number of countries who are not democracies and don't seek to promote democracy in their foreign policies. And so, if you look at, for example, the choices for someone like Prime Minister Abiy in Ethiopia, in terms of who to go to, who to buy drones from, who to get funding from, there's a much broader range of options for him now than he would have had in the past. So that's really significant. The second way in which that plays in is, of course, that international actors on the democracy side, on the Western side, then shift their policies as a result. So, one of the things I think that we've seen that's particularly clear is, for example, in parts of West Africa, I think we start to see countries like France, the UK, the US perhaps shifting their strategies in response to the fear that countries will start to align with Russia, and that means they'll lose countries from their sphere of influence. And that's where the kind of game of global politics and trying to balance that and build an alliance that can check those other countries comes into play. And all of a sudden, we do start to get a sense that certainly in some countries, that fear of losing countries to Russia or to China, it becomes a reason not to call countries out when we see democratic abuses and human rights abuses. So I think in those two ways, the rise of countries like China, Russia, and many others like them is complicating international support for democracy, which, of course, we have to be very frank, was never consistent, was never, as strong as people, would have liked to imagine that it was. So this further weakening, really is quite significant. All of that said, I do still think, and maybe this is another good final sort of point to end on, I do think that actually one of the things that's most important is actually the domestic politics, and the international politics are relatively minor. I think the reason why countries become democracies is because they have strong and effective forces within country that are pro-democracy, and not because it's sustained. For example, if South Africa becomes undemocratic in the next 10 years, it will not be a result of China and Russia. It'll be a result of internal processes within the country and within the ANC. And if South Africa survives, it will not be because of Western powers supporting democracy. It will be because of people fighting for democracy within the Electoral Commission and within civil society. So international context has become much more challenging. That does make it more difficult to protect democracy. But we should also not overestimate the significance of those international factors when it's really the domestic ones that decide how strong democracy is.
Yeah, Nic, I can speak to you for a very long time about a lot of things, but I think just as a closing question, when there are some winds sweeping not only in Africa but other parts of the world as well. Some populism rises, really democracy being pushed back, and taking a couple of steps backwards as opposed to forwards. But how do you see democracy evolving in Africa over the medium term, even longer term? I know it's sometimes difficult, but how can we at least ensure that democracy remains the stronghold in the continent?
I'm always an optimist about this for a couple of reasons. I think that urbanization is going to have a sort of uneven effect, but I think overall it's probably going to encourage and strengthen democracy. I think that the high levels of education we're getting today in many African countries are going to strengthen democracy in the long run. And so I sort of feel like over time, the conditions for democracy are going to get better. So even though we've seen, a couple of really hard years, I am sort of more positive about the long term. I also think that right now, it feels to me like right now authoritarianism is a little bit fashionable. China, Rwanda, those kind of positive examples have sort of made it a bit more sexy. People are bored of the West. They're angry about colonialism and racism for very good reasons. And democracy's name has become a bit tarnished. Democracy seems a bit less interesting. And so I feel like we're in a particular moment where the zeitgeist has moved away from democracy. But I also think that when we see those authoritarian governments in power for a long period of time, so think about those military juntas that took power in West Africa, when they've been in power for a few years, because I don't suspect that they actually really want to give power back to democratic hands anytime soon, I think one of the things that people will see is that actually it's even worse. Right? These guys are more corrupt, they're more violent, they're more incompetent, they're less responsive, they're less inclusive. And then all of a sudden, I think the pendulum will swing back to democracy as people actually see, oh no, these authoritarian regimes aren't what we hoped they were going to be. And then we'll almost go back to that sense of we need a broad coalition for democracy. The heroes will be the people fighting the authoritarians, and we'll get that energy for democracy back. But I think it's going to take a few years for it to happen. That's on democracy. On populism, yeah, I think it's really interesting, that we see a lot of countries in Africa in severe economic difficulties. We have debt crises in places like Ghana, or Zambia obviously already had had the debt failure to pay the debt. Kenya is in a serious challenge when it comes to debt. We also have, declining money, therefore, for public services because people are spending more and more money on debt rather than on providing for their citizens. And that increases the risk that we'll have irresponsible leaders or populist leaders coming through trying to unseat governments on the basis that people are fed up, people are angry, people are upset that the economy has got worse. And one of the things that I would say, to anyone listening from, the more international community, the IMF, the World Bank, the US, and so on, is, if we want democracy to succeed, if we're serious about that, we also need to be serious about making those economies succeed of democratic governments. We need to be serious about helping to build the infrastructure and state capacity of those governments, because we can't expect democracy to survive across Africa if we're in a period of prolonged economic difficulty and there's no financial support. What we'll see is those governments replaced, yes, by populists and others. And the risk then is that what we actually know of populists in power is that although they typically campaign on anti-corruption issues and they typically campaign on the basis that they'll do things for the common man, in general, when they get into power, they break down institutions because they operate as men of the people. They don't need institutions. They're the great individual personality. But also they actually, because they break down institutions, their governments become even more corrupt than the democracies that they replace. And so there's a great risk that if we start to see a significant number of populists win power, one of the things that will then happen will be further erosion of democratic institutions and higher levels of corruption. So I think one of the things, it's a good way to end perhaps, is to remind ourselves that the success of democracy is not about politics alone. It's about enabling democratic governments to deliver economically and to give people the things that they value. And, if we as an international community ignore that, we will find ourselves in a much more authoritarian world in 5 years' time. Sorry,
It's
that
not
wasn't an
a place.
optimistic ending. I started optimistic and then I got pessimistic.
No, it was fairly optimistic. I think we ended there on a good note. Nic, thank you very much for your insights. Let's try and catch up post 29 May following South Africa's elections, and then we can finally know where we stand and where we're going for the next 4 years.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much.